Good evening, Professor McLuhan. That was a very enlightening presentation. Thank you so very much for that, explaining some of your philosophies and beliefs. My friends in the audience, I'd like to invite you now to ask questions of our illustrious presenter. You can do that by writing in the chat. And don't forget, also in the chat is a handout, and you can download that for more information about any of the programs that you see here at Chautauqua. But I'd like to start us off with one question, if I can, Professor McLuhan. You were a little-known professor of literature until the 1960s. How did you become so famous?
Well, I had ambitions to reach a wider audience than just my classes. I taught for a year, as I said, at University of Wisconsin in Madison. And then I moved on to St. Louis University for a number of years, up until 1944. I did take a year off right after I married Corinne, August 4th, 1939. We were married, and then we after a honeymoon that was interrupted by the beginning of World War II, we were in Italy at the time. We got back to England, where I had a year's leave to finish working on my dissertation at Cambridge University. And other than that, I spent my years until 1944 teaching at St. Louis University. And as I taught, I had a desire to reach a larger audience than just my students. I'm primarily a teacher, but I like to think of my students being beyond just the classroom. So I began to seek out engagements to talk to businessmen and to talk about advertising, which was what I was studying for my first book, The Mechanical Bride. I tried out some of those essays as talks to community groups and businessmen. And I began to develop a certain amount of notoriety. Eventually, I sought grants to study advertising in the larger sense of various kinds of media. And that led me to finally come to the attention of an advertising man, a public relations guru named Howard Gossage, known as the Socrates of San Francisco. And he and Gerald Feigen took me on as a client, and they developed a campaign to bring me to the attention of the wider world. And that led to the new journalist Tom Wolfe writing an article about me with the headline, "What if he is right?" And that generated quite a deal of interest. And before long, I was being sought after by newspapers, magazines, and television. And that launched me into a stratosphere of celebrity that is quite unusual for a professor, I must say.
I think it might have been. We have some more questions at this point. Susan Marie Franchek has a question. You've become a celebrity. How is celebrity different in tribal and non-tribal societies?
Well, celebrity is a function of the age of media. So primary oral tribal societies wouldn't have had celebrities in the sense that we know them today. But celebrity is, in effect, an icon, an image. And that is what I have become. The historical, literal, if you will, Marshall McLuhan retires to my home at Widgewood Park in Toronto with my family, my 6 children, and my wife, Corinne. But the image of Marshall McLuhan that you see on the cover of Newsweek or in Woody Allen's film is independent, I would say, of the personal individual, if you will. And more in this technological environment, we are all becoming images. Politicians, more and more, are images rather than real people. And that is what the electoral process is designed these days to sell to the public.
I see. Amy Darnell wants to know, Do you think we'll ever return to being visual creatures?
Well, all of these things are somewhat cyclical. In a book that I've been working on with my son Eric called Laws of Media, we've come up with a tetrad, a four-part structure for analyzing any medium. And one of the things that any medium will do is it will revert into something prior. It will obsolesce other media. It will retrieve media from the past, as well as extending. And so I think inevitably, as new technologies totally revolutionize our technological environment, we will see resurgences and shifts to and from media of the past.
I see. All right. Mina Stone has a technical question. In the video we just saw, were those people in the audience your students? Were you lecturing or were you on a television show?
I was on a television show before the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It was actually right after a screening of a film by the director Truffaut of a Ray Bradbury novel about burning of books. We were discussing that, and that was the audience that you saw in that interview.
I see. I see. Ted Catchell would like to know, do you think our quest for identity will lead to worldwide atomic warfare and destroy ourselves?
Our quest for identity. Well, certainly violence is an outcome of the quest for identity, as I said earlier. I would hope that we can avoid a nuclear confrontation. I think one of the tools in understanding and avoiding that kind of confrontation with the Soviet Union would be to understand that they are a more oral culture than we are. There's a long tradition of the storytelling, folk oral traditions in Russia that we have somewhat moved away from here in the United States and the West. Canada included. But for example, spying for the Russians has to do with bugging audio devices such as telephones. Spying for the United States is a matter of sending airplanes over terrain to photograph the missile sites, etc. So you see there how the Russians are more orally focused, and we are more visual. I'm hoping that as we come to better understand these patterns, we are able to understand and avoid catastrophes such as nuclear war.
That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? You mentioned your mother was an elocutionist. Can you tell us more about the elocutionary movement and its importance?
Well, the elocutionary movement was something that I studied somewhat in my dissertation for the Cambridge University. It was a study of the trivium in education going back to the pre-Socratics all the way up to Thomas Nash, who was a Renaissance pamphleteer and playwright. And so elocution is a movement in the history of rhetoric and the trivium. The trivium is the three-part structure that dominated education for centuries that consists of rhetoric or persuasion, including elocution, and also dialectic or logic and grammar, the study of language. So that three-part structure has dominated our educational system for centuries. And at times, one leg of that trivium would dominate, such as dialectic or logic, and at other times, say, rhetoric would. And when elocution was the rage in the 18th century, the focus was more on delivery as opposed to invention and logic, if you will. So elocution has played an important role in more recent years, and my mother was trained in that art.
Did your mother influence your work?
I would say very much so. My mother was constantly reciting poetry. When I went to Cambridge University, I was considered something of a provincial from the backward sticks of Canada, but I impressed my professors and my fellow students by the large amount of poetry that I had memorized simply by osmosis, being around my mother all those years. And she was a tremendous influence on me. We continued to correspond a great deal while she was touring. When I was going to the University of Manitoba, I have 5 degrees in literature. My first 2 were from the University of Manitoba, a BA and an MA. And I was living at home with my father and my brother Morris, and my mother would tour. And finally, during that period of my life, she moved out of our house in Winnipeg and moved to Toronto to advance her career as an elocutionist. And we, as a result, were not living together, so we corresponded constantly. Even when I went on to graduate school at Cambridge University, we exchanged several letters a week. I was very interested in her performance career, and she in my studies at Cambridge University. So we've been a wonderful support for one another in our respective endeavors. And I would say in some ways I'm as much of a performer, I suppose, as she is in hers.
I suppose so. You are also a jokester and a punster. And Susan Marie Franchek wants to know, do comics vary much around the world? And what does that tell us about their cultures? Do jokes and what people find funny, is it different in each culture?
Very much so. I think every comic is based in grievance. I've actually suggested to the Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, that he create a national Canadian television show about comedy based in ethnic jokes, such as jokes about people from Quebec or Montreal. The way in the United States, I believe you have jokes about Polacks, for example. And these express basic grievances in a humorous way that are ways we address and resolve conflicts among groups within society. So I do think there's great value in the study of jokes, and especially jokes based in ethnicity.
I see. Jeff Hampton would like to know, you mentioned your wife is from Fort Worth, Texas. Were you ever invited to lecture or speak in Texas?
Well, when I first went to Fort Worth, it was to court my wife. I'm afraid my in-laws were, my future in-laws at the time, did not have an obscure professor in mind as a match for their daughter. So it took me some time to ingratiate myself to those relatives in Fort Worth. But as a result, I tended not to go back there very often.
I see. Larry Bounds is with us tonight again. He was here last night. He says, if I'm not to be told you know nothing of my work, what should I know?
Well, don't be a pompous professor from Columbia University standing in line behind Woody Allen. That will get you being told you know nothing of my work. Of course, that was a joke that Woody Allen wrote. But to know seriously what you should know from my work, I would perhaps suggest that you read The Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media, and listen to some of my talks, my lectures. I'm always interested in teaching. I'm interested in probing and provoking my students into thinking for themselves. I don't propose to have a systematic answer to the questions and the phenomena that I observe and comment on. So that's what I would recommend is engage, think for yourself, let your mind be probed and provoked.
Now, you just mentioned the Annie Hall movie. Why did you have to do so many takes for one short scene?
Well, as I said, there was a script, and I had lines that I was supposed to deliver, but Russell Horton, who was the name of the actor who played the Columbia professor, he was improvising, and so I felt emboldened to improvise, and I stumbled a few times. So it did take us 17 or 18 takes, I confess, and those were mostly my fault. And I did insist, though, on getting in that line, that ad-lib line, you think my fallacy is all wrong, and I succeeded in getting that ad-lib in the final cut of the movie. After all those many takes that day, though, it turned out that we still had to re-loop or re-record the audio track subsequently. So even after all those takes, my work wasn't over.
I see. Now, Marianne McCoy wants to know, did you ever appear on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, or were you ever a viewer of that show?
Well, I was never on the show. I was simply the subject of the little poem that the actor named Henry Gibson recited. And I must admit, I wasn't much of a fan of the show, but I did enjoy the notoriety of having been mentioned on the show. And I did study the show enough that I was aware that Rowan and Martin had a distinctive style of comedy that was based more on the pace and the mood that they created rather than what was actually said. Perhaps, once again, an example of the medium being the message. The show itself was somewhat unusual for its time and garnered a great deal of attention as a result.
Professor McLuhan, is there any particular artists in your life that you have found influential, either visual or literary?
Well, as I said earlier, the artist is always historically the first to recognize the impact of new changes in our environment. And that is why we refer to the avant-garde, the advance guard in the arts, particularly in modernism, which is a period that I study a good deal. And of the avant-garde modernist artists, the one that I have found most intriguing is Wyndham Lewis. He is originally a Canadian, like myself, although he was living in England and was part of the Bloomsbury Group, friend to Ezra Pound and other artists and poets of that circle. But before World War II, he came back to the States and to Canada, and that's where I got to know him personally. And I actually undertook to help him receive commissions for his artwork. He was struggling to make money, and so I used what influence I could muster to get him commissions for his artwork. For example, living in St. Louis, I learned of Mrs. Gellhorn, who was interested in a portrait. She was actually the mother-in-law of the writer Ernest Hemingway. And so I was able to help Wyndham Lewis get a commission to paint her portrait. But what particularly interested me about Wyndham Lewis as an artist was his philosophy or manifesto of vorticism in the arts. A kind of cubism-like force, very much in the avant-garde of the visual art of its time. And he also was a writer, a satirist, a novelist, and all round a fascinating character, although a little bit of a difficult personality, I must say.
I see. Now, did you consider becoming an elocutionist yourself? If not, why not?
No, I found an outlet for my histrionic interests in the classroom, I would say, rather than on stage. I've loved going to plays all my life, and my letters to my mother back in Toronto often described the plays that I was seeing, and I loved to hear her tell me about the plays she was directing. She directed plays by T.S. Eliot, for example, in Detroit as well as Toronto. And theater has been a love of mine, but no, I haven't felt drawn to the stage per se.
And what are your religious beliefs, Professor?
I am a Roman Catholic. I was raised in the Protestant religion. My mother was Baptist. My father was Methodist. They brought my brother Morris and myself up attending a variety of Protestant churches. We went where the preaching was best, I would say, rather than following any particular doctrinaire approach. But I started at a fairly impressionable age to read G.K. Chesterton. And that began to interest me in his Catholicism. And from there, in my studies for my PhD at Cambridge University, I did an intellectual study of the role of the church in rhetoric and the trivium. And so I had an intellectual understanding of the Catholic Church that then resulted in a need to test my own faith and to pray for a sign, which eventually I did achieve. And in 1937, I converted to the Catholic Church. And I've remained a devout Roman Catholic ever since.
Let's see. Our friend Daniel Bratton says he doesn't remember the Henry Gibson poem on Laugh-In that you alluded to. What was it?
I mentioned it at the beginning of my film earlier. It was Marshall McLuhan, "What Are You Doing?" Spoken with a Southern accent, as I said.
And Mina Stone wants to know why you have 5 degrees.
Well, it's an example of how Canada was viewed as a backward country in comparison to England. I did my BA and my MA at Manitoba, and then I received a scholarship to go to Cambridge University for a PhD, but they required me to repeat my BA and my MA in order to make up for what they perceived as the deficiencies of my Canadian education.
Aha. Now, Susan Marie Franchek backs us up to an earlier question. What was the sign you received to, I think she was referring to your religious conversion?
I must say that is private, and I don't talk about that in public.
I see. And I'm going to end with one last question for you, Professor McLuhan. Do you consider yourself a philosopher or an artist?
I am often identified as a philosopher, and I don't seek that mantle, so to speak. I noticed I was introduced earlier as a philosopher. No, I consider myself an artist in the broad sense of a poet who practices techne, the craft of poetry, of language. In that broad sense, I would identify myself as an artist. And in general, I look for perceptions in the world, the way an artist will also perceive when a painter is observing a landscape for a painting or creating, even abstractly. It is the feelings, the perceptions that are important. And so I consider myself someone who seeks percepts rather than concepts. So to that degree, I consider myself more of an artist than a philosopher.
I see. Thank you so much, Professor McLuhan. I'd like to join you on stage now, if I may. And thank you again for your presentation. And now, my friends, I would like to introduce the scholar that stands behind the character. This is Dr. John Dennis Anderson. He is a professor emeritus from Emerson College. He was a professor of communication studies. He's a veteran Chautauquan. He's been in Oklahoma, I think, 8 or 9 times. And I have a tip for you. He'll be back next year. So at any rate, John, thank you. That was really, really lovely. Really, yeah, your film was provocative and your questions were interesting. We have a couple more questions came in as I was finishing here, but so I'm going to ask. Oh, this is an interesting question. Susan Marie Franchak wants to know: was McLuhan the first person who was famous for being famous?
Who coined that phrase? I know I've seen it in Leo Brody's book about celebrity, and it's sort of a cliche now of what it means to be a celebrity, somebody famous for being famous. No, I don't think by any means McLuhan would have been the first to be famous for being famous. Although certainly there have been more and more people, where you have people like Paris Hilton today. There's also the saying that's associated with Andy Warhol that everyone is famous for 15 minutes. And I've heard it suggested that actually was something that McLuhan might have originally said, but I don't know if for sure that's the case. Who would be an example? Oh, I don't know. Evelyn Nesbit, I think, who was a scandalous celebrity in the period of ragtime, as in E.L. Doctorow's novel of the period, would have been somebody who predates McLuhan as being famous for being famous.
An earlier question that came in from our friend Michael Hughes, and so I saved it for this portion of the program. What particular did you find most challenging about reaching an understanding of McLuhan?
Well, everything. I came to McLuhan primarily through his mother. I'm interested in the history of the performance of literature, especially in relation to Emerson College, where I taught for 27 years. And when I learned that Marshall McLuhan's mother had studied with graduates of Emerson College, that led me to do an article about Elsie McLuhan and her elocutionary experiences. So what was the most difficult? I don't know. Once I decided to shift from Elsie to Marshall, I was just daunted by how dazzling all the things he synthesized were. Buckminster Fuller has said that Marshall McLuhan was more a popularizer than an original thinker. And part of what I think Buckminster Fuller is getting at is how wide-read Marshall McLuhan was and how adept he was at synthesizing so many ideas from all kinds of disciplines. He was very interdisciplinary as a thinker. And so I think that was the hardest challenge, was to wrap my head around the scope of everything that he knew, that he synthesized in such compelling ways. And then finding a way to boil down into, about 40 minutes, some key ideas, because there was no way I was going to be able to cover everything.
Right. That's always a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't get it all in. There's no way. While you were on the subject of Elsie McLuhan, one of the guests asked before I made the change, did his mother perform on the Chautauqua circuits?
Not to my knowledge. I was looking for that. And she performed the work of Pauline Johnson, who was an indigenous Canadian poet performer who did travel on the Chautauqua circuit. So she was aware of the Chautauqua circuit, I'm sure. She tended to perform in churches and civic organizations. She wasn't on the so-called Chautauqua circuit, like the Red Path Bureau. But what she did was very comparable to the Chautauqua circuit, but she sort of was an independent entrepreneur as an elocutionist, and managed herself rather than, I think I came across a couple of references to agents that she wasn't very happy with. So I think she did dabble with having an agent represent her, but mostly she did her own drumming up of business.
Uh-huh. Now, I'm trying to think what Larry Bounds is referring to. Larry Bounds looked up on Wikipedia, and the term that he is referring to originates from an analysis of the media-dominated world called The Image, a guide to pseudo-events in America by historian and social theorist Daniel Boorstin. Which term are we talking about? Hey,
Well,
I think
unfortunately, I can't see the chat, so I don't.
He doesn't say the term that he's talking about.
I'm familiar with Borston's work, but I don't really understand the question.
I don't. He's giving information, commenting on something. And part of the problem with the chat is they're already on to the next topic, and by the time one of our guests wants to know if Sonia Dunn wants to know, is McLuhan your favorite character? Oh, famous for being famous. Larry Bounds is talking about famous for being famous.
Oh, yes, I do think Boorstin cites that. Yeah, yes. It's not just Leo Braudia, but it's Boorstin as well. Yeah, good point. Is that what you were saying? Is that's where that's discussed?
Yes, that's where the term comes from Boorstin. Famous for being famous.
Got it.
Yes. Thank you, my friend Larry. I know Larry very well. He's also a fellow Chautauquan.
By the way, I figured out why I couldn't see the chat. I was clicked on handouts. So now
there's a problem. Okay. Ted Catchell wants to know, did issues of gender or sexuality become a media that would fit into his perceptive take on how we organize our identities?
Well, Marshall McLuhan was fairly conservative, as you might infer from his Roman Catholicism, on issues of gender and sexuality. And that's about all I can say about that. I don't really know how that fits into media. He did comment occasionally on the early feminist movement, but more as, one of his observations. I don't know that it really figured significantly in his theory or his concept of media, his percepts of media, if you will.
I see. Now, Andrew Crystal wants to know, would you advocate for creating a performance of a character as a model, as a mode of teaching?
Well, I think it is a mode of teaching. And a number of us have actually trained people in our college courses, such as Karen and myself. I taught a course on living history performance at Emerson College. And so, yes, I think it is an outstanding way of engaging students with history, with literature, with performance, and with public speaking skills, critical thinking. It's just a cornucopia.
A wonderful way to integrate scholarship and performance. Absolutely. And I don't know about you, but my students beg for the class. When's that class coming around again?
Yeah.
But Sonia Dunn is upset. She wants to know what happened to her question. Is McLuhan your favorite character?
Oh, hi, Sonia. So nice to see you. A former student of mine at Emerson College. Well, it's hard to say who your favorite characters are, especially when you're in the thick of one. I would have to say McLuhan presents unique rewards and challenges that have endeared me to performing McLuhan as a Chautauqua character. He's the least literary, so to speak, in that he's not a creative writer like Henry James or William Faulkner or Robert Frost or Ernest Hemingway, but he is an artist and even a kind of, I think, proto-performance artist. I don't know that he would have seen himself explicitly in those terms, but so that aspect of McLuhan has been fascinating to me.
Now, we've had two nice compliments. John Gentile says, great work. And someone who's unnamed says, a usual flawless presentation, but who could be surprised when it's done by John Anderson?
No.
So not sure who said that. But Mina Stone had a really good question. What would McLuhan's opinions and thoughts be on media today with Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram? I know you've gotten that question as in character, which you can't answer because it wasn't around when he was there, but what would he think of it?
Well, I think he would have anticipated that there would be something to replace television. New technologies would keep coming along, and he was very aware of computers, but we didn't yet have personal computers in 1980 when he died in the sense we have them today. And of course, we didn't have the World Wide Web or the internet or social media. But I think he would have, been able to foresee that there would be a new technology that, according to his tetrad, would extend certain senses, would obsolesce other media, would retrieve, and etc. So I think he wouldn't be terribly surprised at what has happened, and it's consistent. Digital technology through computers has kind of reinvented television. Some of what he says about television sounds a little odd. Like, he talks about television as low definition, and of course that's what it was in the 60s and the 70s. Today we have high definition television. So television has flipped into a whole new medium, I think, a whole new technology today from what it was in his time. And similarly, computers have now become a new kind of orality, even though it's something we type, but it's this simultaneous bombardment through social media that's very much part of the tribalism that he was foreseeing in the future as becoming more and more intense as time went on.